Hello, friends. Welcome to Season 3, Episode 4, Historical Fiction with Olivia Tonn. Hello, guys. Welcome back to the Inked Podcast. Today's topic is historical fiction from an author's point of view. And here to help me talk about this is my friend Olivia Tonn. So how are you doing today, Miss Olivia?
I'm doing well, thank you.
So, Olivia is a writer, reader, and a wannabe editor who loves fangirling over books when she's not frantically typing out stories to help readers find encouragement through the dark seasons. She can be found reading voraciously, recommending books to her friends, or dancing around the kitchen while singing at the top of her lungs. And I am just so glad that she has joined us today because I've gotten to know her personally and gotten to meet her. And so I'm really excited to get to talk to you about this today. Now, we do have the fact that we've gone through quite a few brainstorming sessions as historical fiction authors, and you have always had such creative and adventurous ideas, Olivia, and I'm just so excited to get to talk to you about your gift. And our first question for today is, why did you personally choose historical fiction?
Well, I kind of joke that I didn't choose historical fiction and historical fiction chose me because when I was first sitting down and deciding that yes, I wanted to be an author and I wanted to be a writer and this is what I wanted to do, I remember thinking I would never want to write historical fiction because of all the research. I just think that would be too overwhelming. But then as I went on and got into writing more and started writing more seriously, I ended up writing historical fiction. I think it was kind of a natural transition because that's what I read most. But I just really loved the style of historical fiction, and I really loved the themes and prose that a lot of the historical fiction books that I read had. So I did end up coming to love the research aspect of it too.
That's really true, though. I feel like a lot of historical fiction authors don't originally intend to be historical fiction authors. They're just kind of like, oh, I'm writing this story and it's kind of turning into historical fiction. Or I read a lot of historical fiction and I guess I'll try it. And then they end up trying it and loving it. And the research doesn't bother them. And they just love their job and love what they do. That's how it was for me when I started writing historical fiction. So that is a wonderful answer to our first question because historical fiction can be something that involves a lot of research, which leads us a little bit into our next question, which is, what is your favorite thing about writing in historical fiction?
I really love getting to try and bring more emotion to history, and to make characters that people relate to. Because I think that it's easy for us to look back when we're learning in history class or even just reading about history on our own for fun and thinking that it's hard to relate to these big historical events like wars and floods and famines and plagues and all these things. It's hard to picture ourselves there and it's hard to relate to the people who were experiencing these things. So I really like writing historical fiction because I find it really fun to create common everyday people who lived in this time period and had to deal with the common struggles that were going on at the time and to try and show how they feel about it so that readers who live in a completely different era can read and think, wow, this is totally different from anything I've ever had to go through. And the societal standards at the time were so different, but I can still relate to the feelings that this person is feeling. And then I also really love to inspire people to see nuances more, because when you look at history through historical fiction specifically, I think it's a lot more easier to see that things aren't as clear cut as they always are in the history books, and that
Mm,
it's easier to see beyond these stereotypes. So I think historical fiction is fun to write also just because it inspires readers to learn more about the people in their own lives and love those people well and just to live well.
I love that so much. I honestly agree with that a lot because in writing historical fiction, it, it, I always thought of it as zooming in on history. So, like, you have these things that we talk about really broadly, that we talk about, like, oh, you've got the world wars and you've got, like, all of these huge historical events, and you look at them from a very broad stance when you like learn about them in school. But when you are a historical fiction author or a historical fiction reader, you get to zoom in on one person and you get to see what it would have been like to be in that through like a creative perspective. Or like if you're a kid, you get to see, oh, kid's perspective. Or like if you're an adult, you get to see an adult's perspective, and you get to see the emotion that goes into the history, less of just the factual part of it.
That's what I love. I love getting to pull in the emotion and, like you were saying, just getting to look at things from the different perspective of widely different people in the same time period to see what it would have been like for people in different social standings or cultural situations during the same event.
That is so true. Now that we've seen why you chose historical fiction and why you love historical fiction, what is your biggest like annoyance or your biggest like hardest part that you find of writing historical fiction?
Well, for me, it's the research because I really want to be sure that I am being historically accurate and not just historically accurate, but that I'm also being respectful of my characters and of the reader and of the people who lived in this time. So I want to be very careful that I'm not writing anything inaccurately or portraying any stereotypes. So the research is hard for me because it's often hard to find the very specific information that I need. And I just struggle with knowing how much research I should do, when I should stop, because I don't want to spend all my time researching a book and then never writing it.
That's so true though, because we sit and we research it for like, I think I researched for almost a year of the original idea of one of my stories, and just ended up with all of these extra details that I didn't really need, and all of these things that I didn't really want to put in the story, but that I just wanted to make sure that I had them in case I needed them to be historically accurate. Which that leads us into our next question: how do you go about like researching before you start the story, during the story, and like when you go to edit the story? How do you research during each part of that?
Well, researching beforehand, lots and lots and lots and lots of reading. Reading nonfiction. I like reading nonfiction about the general time period, especially if I'm not sure where exactly to start. I like to read historical fiction for inspiration. Um, I do have to be careful with that because I want to be sure that I'm reading something that's historically accurate. So, going to the library is great because of that. I like going to museums as well. That's actually one of my favorite ways to research if you have a good museum nearby. I just think that it's really fun. I've been to the Civil War Museum that's nearby me 3 times, and each time I've come away having learned something new that I put in my book, and I am absolutely going back again. Also, the museums do have libraries too, even if they're small or even if they just have a shelf or two of books. So I love getting to look at those. Documentaries are helpful. I don't watch a ton of those, but when I do, I've found them helpful. Looking at a general knowledge of history, even in history classes, I found that to be surprisingly helpful as well, just because it's good for me to get an idea of everything that's going on in the world, to understand big world events at the time and what would have been in the news, what the characters in my story would have heard about, even if it isn't directly affecting them.
Yeah. So I agree with the museums. Fun fact, I actually, when I was writing my pirate historical fiction novel, I went to a Mariners Museum that's very close to where I live. It's only about 20-30 minutes away. And we drove and went there and got to look at all of the different, they had a life-size like ship from one of those time periods, and that was really cool. I've gotten to see a lot of like, my family has driven like quite a while to go see like historical Jamestown, historical Williamsburg, Monticello, a lot of like historical sites, which is really awesome when you go about like writing it, especially if you're writing descriptions of like places. It's as if you can see those things physically and you get to understand exactly the scale of them. So like museums definitely are helpful. I've found that I do a lot of reading I'm not even gonna lie. I use Britannica a lot.
Well, Britannica is good. It's there, it exists, and it is very helpful if you could find something specific about information that you need.
It kind of narrows it down a lot of the time. So when I'm reading for, like, if I'm reading in a book, I feel like there's a lot of information that I don't necessarily need or want sometimes. But like when you use Britannica, it narrows it down a lot. So you can look up like a specific topic and it'll be like, okay, specific topic. Which aspect of this topic do you want? So I suggest using Britannica, but definitely hard like copy books that you have that are like from your schoolwork or anything like that is super helpful and makes our job so much easier as historical fiction writers.
I
Now,
think
once oh, go ahead.
I think it's also helpful to look at more general books when you're in the early on stage of not quite being sure what information you need to know yet, because then you can have a place to start with. Here's a more general overview of the time period. What specific information do I need to know looking off of what's available?
Yes, that is really true. Um Now we are both historical fiction authors. We've both done a lot of stories, done a lot of research in our time. We've also had a lot of brainstorming sessions together. So, in writing historical fiction, what is like the one thing that you always find like do you have a specific I guess I'm asking if you have a specific time period that you always come back to? Like that you always end up writing in?
I do not, and that's made me quite sad because I wish very much that I would only have to ever research in one time period. I do have a soft spot for the 1800s and early 1900s, and I also have a soft spot for the Civil War. I love writing stories that take place in the Civil War, and more recently, I've gotten interested in writing stories during World War One and World War Two as well. But I don't have
Mm.
one specific time period. No.
I I am one of those people that leans towards a specific time period sometimes, but then there's like also the part of me that's like, I'll branch out and try something else and do even more research for a different time period.
Because
Um, I I have done I think I lean more towards like the 1800s, 1900s. I did one that was in like the early 2000s and I was like, what am I doing? What is this?
I think early 2000s would mess with my brain too much. It feels too soon to qualify as historical fiction.
I know it does though, because like there it's leaning more towards being modern, and I'm like, no, this is not what I want to write. I did it once, and was like, no, I'm done, never again. Like I'm going to go back to my 1800s, 1900s, possibly 1700s. Like I'm good in this little gap of space right here. I have gone back to like medieval historical fiction before though, which was really interesting when I did that. Because medieval historical fiction is it's interesting.
I have never done much medieval historical fiction, and I don't honestly think that I've read much that wasn't specifically targeted towards middle grade. So I would absolutely be interested in reading more good medieval historical fiction for YA or adult because it feels like there isn't much of it that isn't very heavily involved with a romance plot as well.
So people do tend to take the medieval aspect and sometimes they'll romanticize it, but also there's the fact of a lot of people lean, oh, if it's medieval, it's not historical fiction, it goes into fantasy. So they end up leaning more towards the fantasy aspect. And honestly, I think that any time period can be turned into a fantasy, but people do it with medieval a lot of the time, and medieval doesn't always have to be fantasy. I've written books that are just medieval because during that time period there was a lot of interesting things happening. There was a lot of interesting like material to work with, and it's definitely been worth it to try that before.
Yeah, the medieval was just a fascinating time period.
It was rather interesting. Well, we are coming up on the end of our time for today. So I thank you, Olivia, for being here. You've been awesome and had so much insight on being a historical fiction author.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been an honor.
I really hope we'll get to have you again. And thank you, listeners, for being here to close up this episode of the Inked podcast. Bye, guys.